In this video, we will learn how to add to our Swagger UI page documentation for the login web service endpoint. And the way I'm going to do it is going to be a little bit unusual. At the time of recording this video, I could not find SprintFox documentation on how to configure the default login web service endpoint from within my Spring Boot project. So I could not find documentation on how to change the web service URL path and how to specify the a JSON payload that should be sent in the body of HTTP request, and how to create documentation for the response headers, for example. It is very much possible that with the next release of SprintFox documentation, it will be available, but for now, I will show you a little workaround on how we can still document the login web service endpoint and how to make it work. So because the documentation for the RESTful web service endpoints is generated based on the controllers that we add and the annotations that we use for those controllers, I will simply create a new controller class, and inside of that controller class, I will create the login method. And I will document that login method to have a proper request body, and I will specify the headers that this login web service endpoint will return. So creating this new controller class and a login method inside of that class will help me to get Swagger to generate the documentation for that login method. And I will have this documentation available in my Swagger page. So let's do that. I will switch back to my Sprint tool suite, and I will go to controllers package, and I'll create a new controller class. New class. You can give it any name. I'll call it something like authentication controller, like this, and I'll click on finish. And I will make it a REST controller, so I will add annotation to it, REST controller. And let me import it. And I will add a login method here, so that's going to be public void, and you can call it any way you like. So let's call it the fake login, and this fake login method will need to be mapped to HTTP post request. So I will use post mapping, and I will create a path for it, /login, like this. Let me import post mapping. Okay, so now we have our login method. Let me save this and let me restart my application and see how it looks now. So I'll start it up, check if it's already running. Okay, it started. Switch back to my browser window, and I will refresh my Swagger documentation. Okay, so now I have the authentication controller here, and if I expand it, I have the login method. Now, if I expand it, I don't have much information here. So I don't have the body of HTTP request, and I don't have the two HTTP response headers that I need. Remember that when login is successful, we will get back the authorization header, which is our JSON web token, and we will get back a user ID in the header. So we don't have it included yet. Now, let's go back to our Sprint tool suite, and we will document this fake login method to have this information. And before we do that, we will throw an exception here, throw new, all right, and we will add a message here. The reason I'm throwing an illegal state exception here is because this method should not actually be called if HTTP post request is sent to this path. This is because Sprint Security Framework will catch a request sent to a login, and it will override it, and it will use its own login web service to respond. So technically, even though we have added this method, it will never be actually triggered if we send a request to it. So I'm adding an exception here to make sure that this method is never used, and I will add a description here so that it's even more clear. So I will add something like this method should not be called, and that this method is actually implemented by Sprint Security. So this method, like this. Okay, so this method should not be called, and that this method is implemented by Sprint Security. And because a login web service endpoint needs to accept request body, and in that request body, it needs to accept email and password, I will add a request body to it. So that will be a request body annotation. And we do not have that request body yet. We will need to create a new class, and I will call it a login request model. Let me import request body, and let's go and create this login request model. So that's going to be in request package. I'll create a new class here, new class, and I will call it login request model. Click on finish and add a couple of fields here. Let me generate getters and setters for it. Select all, generate, and let me format my source code like this. Now I'll go back to authentication controller and I will import the login request model. Okay, now let's save this and let's restart our application and check the Swagger UI page and see how it looks now. So I'll start it up, check my console. Okay, now go back to my Swagger UI and refresh this page. Check up the authentication controller. I have now login web service endpoint. I'll open it up and now I see that my login web service endpoint accepts a request body, which is email and password. So this is done. We have now documented that our login web service endpoint accepts the following information. Now we need to provide the response. It's very important that the users of our API, they know that if the login is successful, they should get back authorization header and they should get back user ID, which is a part of a header as well. So let's do that. Let's go back to our Spring Tool Suite, close this, and I'm going to paste a few lines of code. And now let me import API responses. Oh, it doesn't see it. API response. Oh, this is so strange. Okay, let me paste the imports and see if it fixes the problem. So I'll paste it. Okay, so that fixed the problem. Strange. So we'll need to import API response, API responses, and response header that come from IO Swagger annotations package. Okay, so what we're doing here, we are configuring a response for this web service endpoint, and there might be multiple responses. We are just configuring one for this moment. So this API responses can take multiple entries and we're configuring one at this moment. So this API response is for HTTP status code 200. There is a description message that you can customize, provide a different one. I provided here response headers, and I'm configuring two response headers that should be included in the Swagger UI page in the documentation. I'm configuring that there is one response header which is an authorization. It will have authorization name and its description that users will see is also up to you. Make it descriptive enough for users to understand. I providing an exact use here. So this is a beer, and then there will be a JSON web token value here. And the type of this header is string. And the second one, response header, is the user ID. And I'm also providing a description that there will be a public user ID value here. And it's also a string class. All right, so now let me save this. And one more thing, if I go back to my browser window and scroll up here, see next to the login web service endpoint path, it says the fake login. So this is the method name. We can override this method name here by providing a more friendlier description so that they don't see this fake login. Okay, and to do that, there is an annotation which is called API operation. So I will use it, API operation, and it takes in a string value, which is a description. So I will provide something like user login and save this. Let me import API operation. Now this time it does see it. So I will just import it, save this, and now let me start my application and check the Swagger UI page and see how it looks now. Check the console. Okay, it started. Go back to the browser window, close this and refresh the page. Okay, so now I will open up the authentication controller, and I see that the login now has a better description. It says user login instead of that fake login. And if I open it up, I see the login request model, and I see the section which is called response header, which contains two headers. One is authorization and another is user ID and the values that they can have. So very good. Now when users look at this web service endpoint, they can see which information they need to provide in the request to be able to log in, and what information they need to expect once the login is successful. All right, so let's now try this web service endpoint and see how it works. And to do that, I will first create a new user. So I will go back to my user controller, and I will first create a new user by sending HTTP request to /users. So that's going to be JSON, and the response I also want to see as JSON. I will look up a request that we used to send to create a new user. So this one, HTTP post, and I'll copy the body of this HTTP post request and go back to my Swagger and click on this try it out button, and we'll paste the JSON payload here. Okay, so now I can click on execute button to send this HTTP post request and create a new user. Okay, I'll scroll down, and the HTTP status code is 200. I have the response, the user is created. Email address is test1@test.com, so I will copy it. And the password is 123, so let me copy the email address. And now go to login and click on this try it out button, and the email address is test1@test.com and password is 123. And I'll try to log in first. I'm sending the request and I get back unauthorized. The access is forbidden. And this is because when we create a new user, before we can log in, we need to confirm our email address. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my database, and I'm going to manually update the database table field and confirm my email address that way. Let me log in, and I'll go to users, select all from users, and now I will update this email verification status field. So update users, set email verification status field is equal to true. And let's, because I have only one record, I can send it this way without providing user ID or email address. So I'll run selected query. Now I will select all from users, and email verification status is now true. So I should be able to log in. I'll go back to my login request and repeat it by clicking on this execute button. And let me now scroll down, and we still have 403Y. Let's check that the path to our login web service is correct. So I'll go back to my Sprint tool suite, and I'll go to Sprint security and open up web security and look up the path to my user login. Okay, so I need to add users in front of the login. This is why. And to do that, I will first need to go to my authentication controller and change the path here. So we have /login. Now we need to add /users /login. Okay, so I'll change this. Now let me restart my application and try it again. So I will start up my project, check the console. It started. Go back to my Swagger, and first I will need to create a new user. So I will send HTTP post request now. Okay, the user is created. I'll go to console, copy this query so I don't have to type, re-log in, connect. Now I will select all from users. Email verification status is false. I'll paste these queries and I will run them. Run, select. Okay, now it's true. So I'll go back to my Swagger and refresh the page. I'll go to authentication controller. The path to login is now different, /users login. Let's try it one more time. So I click on try it, and it's going to be test1@test.com, and the password is 123. Okay, let's send this and look up at the response. So this time we get a 200 HTTP status code, which is successful. And now we have the authorization, bearer, and the token, and we also have the user ID in our headers. So this time it worked, and we can now use this bearer token in all other HTTP requests that in our REST controller to get all users and to get a specific user. Let's, for example, get all users. So I'll get back to login, copy this bearer, and now fold it, go to users, click on try it out, and paste the token here. So this is our bearer and then the token value. And now I can send this request. Okay, and I get back HTTP status code 200, and I have a response which is in XML, but I can view it in JSON as well. And repeat this. Here we go. So now I have a list of users. I have only one user in the list, but it's working. I get back a successful response. All right, so our login is working well. Let's continue.